The $118,000 demand, specificity and knowledge access analysis. We've walked through handwriting that couldn't be excluded and notes too long to serve their stated purpose. We've traced maternal hearing that should have woken and windows that stayed stubbornly closed. And now we need to pause at something so specific, so precisely calibrated, that it sits in that ransom note like a fingerprint pointing not outward but inward. We need to think about the number. $118,000. Not a round number that would make sense for someone choosing arbitrarily. Not a figure easily explained by external knowledge or public information. But a number that matched, almost to the dollar, John Ramsey's year-end bonus, a figure that would be known to very few people outside the family's most intimate financial circle. And this precision, this specificity that narrows the field of who could possibly have chosen such an amount, sits in that note asking to be explained, refusing to align with narratives of strangers and foreign factions. Let's establish what we're examining before we begin to interpret its significance. From a criminological perspective, ransom amounts in actual kidnapping cases follow predictable patterns. Criminals demand round numbers: 100,000, 250,000, $500,000, $1 million. These are numbers that communicate scale without requiring specific knowledge of the victim's finances. They're psychologically resonant, big enough to feel substantial, round enough to avoid the cognitive load of specific calculation. But 118,000. From a logical standpoint, this number requires explanation. It's not round. It's not a figure you would arrive at through estimation or general knowledge of someone's wealth. It's specific enough to suggest calculation, knowledge, access to information that wouldn't be available to someone operating from outside the family's financial intimacy. And when we learn that this oddly specific number matched John's bonus that year, we're no longer in the realm of coincidence. We're looking at insider knowledge, at a number chosen by someone who knew, who had access to information that should have been private. Theme 1, the architecture of precision, when numbers tell their own story. When we think about how people choose ransom amounts, we're thinking about psychology and what feels right to the demander's sense of what will work. From a psychological perspective, if you're genuinely trying to extract money in exchange for returning someone, you want an amount that's achievable, large enough to make the crime worthwhile, but not so large that the family couldn't possibly obtain it. And you want an amount that doesn't require you to reveal knowledge you shouldn't have. If you demand exactly someone's annual salary, or precisely their savings account balance, or specifically their bonus amount, you're telling the family something dangerous, that you know things about their private finances. You're narrowing the field of suspects to people who would have access to that information. From a criminological standpoint, this is exactly what actual criminals try to avoid. They keep demands vague enough that knowledge of private financial details isn't required, because they understand that specificity creates investigative leads pointing back toward them. Let's think about what $118,000 actually represents in the context of that year, that family, that specific financial moment. It wasn't John's total income. It wasn't the value of their home or their savings. It was his bonus, a specific component of his compensation package, the kind of information you wouldn't know unless you saw the actual paperwork, unless you were intimately involved in the family's finances, unless you were someone who had reason to know not just that John was successful, but precisely how that success translated into specific dollar amounts in specific categories of compensation. From an anthropological lens, different cultures and contexts treat financial information with different levels of privacy, but across most contexts, the specific details of someone's bonus structure remain relatively closely held. This isn't public information. This isn't something you could learn from casual observation or general knowledge of someone's business success. This is insider knowledge, the kind of information that exists within families, within the intimate financial partnerships of marriage. From a philosophical perspective, we need to ask, if you're choosing a ransom amount and you have insider knowledge, why would you use it? Why would you choose a number that immediately tells investigators, intimate financial details about the family? The answer that makes sense from a genuine kidnapping perspective: you wouldn't. You would choose a round number, specifically to avoid revealing that you have insider knowledge, specifically to avoid narrowing the investigative field toward people who would know such details. But if you're not actually trying to collect ransom, if the note is staging meant to create the appearance of external involvement, then the calculation changes. You might choose a specific number because it feels authentic to you, because in your mind, a kidnapper who has researched the family would know such things, because you're drawing from what's available in your own knowledge without fully thinking through what that knowledge reveals about your position relative to the family. Now, let's consider what explanations have been offered for this specificity and whether they hold under examination. Some have suggested the bonus amount might have been available through business records, that someone targeting John's company could have accessed this information. From a logical standpoint, this explanation strains credibility. Business records don't typically detail individual bonus amounts for executives in ways that would be accessible to outsiders. Even if such information existed in some form, it would require deliberate research, specific targeting, the kind of preparation that doesn't align with other elements of how events allegedly unfolded. And it requires us to believe in remarkable coincidence, that someone who somehow researched John's specific bonus amount then broke into his house on the night they allegedly acted, that the targeting was so specific and yet the execution was so chaotic. The more elements we're asked to believe coincided, the less plausible the overall narrative becomes. Let's shift to thinking about what the number psychologically represents beyond its literal value. From a psychological perspective, $118,000 isn't a figure that would naturally occur to someone thinking about large amounts of money. If you ask someone to name a substantial ransom amount, they'll say 100,000, 200,000, $500,000. Round numbers that the mind can easily grasp and communicate. But 118? That's not how the human mind naturally conceives of large sums when thinking in the abstract. That's how you think when you're dealing with a specific number you already know, a figure that already exists in your mental landscape because you've seen it on documents, discussed it in conversations, understood it as a specific component of your family's financial reality. The number's oddness, its resistance to being a natural choice, becomes evidence that it wasn't chosen from imagination or general targeting, but was drawn from specific, intimate knowledge. From a criminological perspective, let's consider what actual ransom demands look like when criminals have researched their targets. Even in cases where extensive planning occurred, where victims were specifically chosen based on wealth, ransom demands tend toward round numbers that represent fractions or multiples of estimated wealth. You demand 10% of their net worth, or twice what you think they can raise in cash quickly, or amounts that represent comprehensible portions of their resources. But you don't demand exactly their bonus amount unless that number has specific meaning to you, unless it already exists in your knowledge so firmly that it feels natural, available, the right amount to demand. The specificity suggests not careful planning by an outsider, but the unconscious revelation of insider knowledge, the writer reaching for a number that felt right because it was already meaningful within their own understanding of the family's finances. From a physiological standpoint, let's think about stress and number selection. Someone under the kind of stress that would exist if genuinely executing a kidnapping, someone whose nervous system is flooded with stress hormones and fear of discovery, would struggle to engage in the kind of complex financial calculation that would be required to arrive at a specific non-round number. The brain under stress defaults to simpler processing, reaches for round numbers, avoids unnecessary cognitive load. But someone under a different kind of stress, someone processing trauma, someone trying to create staging while already knowing intimate details about the family's finances, might naturally reach for a number that already existed in their knowledge, that felt specific enough to be convincing, without fully processing what that specificity would reveal about who could have chosen it. So, when we step back and consider the architecture of precision, $118,000, matching John's bonus, requiring insider financial knowledge, defying explanation through external targeting or coincidence, we're looking at a number that refuses to support the intruder narrative. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the specificity points inward rather than outward, suggests a writer who knew because they had intimate access to family finances, someone for whom this number already existed in their mental landscape and felt natural to include despite what its specificity would reveal. The number isn't just a ransom demand. It's evidence sitting in that note like a signature, whispering about access and knowledge and the intimacy of information that should have remained private, but instead became the centerpiece of what was supposed to look like a communication from strangers who could never have known such details. Theme 2, the psychology of significance, what meaning reveals about mind. We've established that the number reveals insider knowledge, and now we need to think about what it means that this particular number was chosen. Because it's not just that someone knew John's bonus amount, it's that they chose to use it as the ransom demand, that this number felt significant enough to be the amount requested. From a psychological perspective, we need to ask, why would this specific number have psychological weight for the writer? What would make it feel like the right amount to demand, not just logically, but emotionally? And when we sit with these questions, when we think about who would find John's bonus amount psychologically significant, we find ourselves looking not at strangers who learned a number through research, but at someone for whom that number already carried meaning, already represented something important in their understanding of the family's financial life. Let's think about what a bonus represents within a family's financial reality. From an anthropological perspective, a bonus isn't just money. It's a marker of success, of achievement, of the husband and father's position in the world beyond the home. In many family structures, particularly in the era and socioeconomic context we're examining, the husband's income, and particularly his bonus, would be known to the wife, discussed, perhaps even celebrated, as evidence of the family's security and status. So, for someone embedded in that family structure, John's bonus amount wouldn't be just a number on paper. It would be a figure that carried emotional and psychological weight, that represented the family's financial achievement, that might even be a source of pride or security. This kind of psychological significance doesn't exist for external actors. For them, it's just a number, one of many possible numbers. But for someone inside the family, it's meaningful, significant, the kind of figure that might naturally come to mind when trying to think of an amount that felt substantial but achievable. From a philosophical perspective, we need to think about what it means when staging reveals the stager's psychology. When someone is creating false evidence, they think they're constructing a narrative that points away from themselves. But unconsciously, they often include elements that reveal their actual position, their actual knowledge, their actual relationship to what happened. The choice of John's bonus amount as the ransom demand might represent exactly this kind of unconscious self-revelation. The writer thought they were creating evidence of external targeting of someone who had researched the family and knew their finances. But what they actually created was evidence of intimate insider knowledge, of someone for whom this number was already psychologically available and significant. The staging reveals the stager despite the stager's intentions to conceal themselves. Now let's consider alternative explanations for why this specific amount might have been chosen and whether they withstand scrutiny. Some have suggested it was meant to look like insider knowledge, that an external actor deliberately chose a specific number to create the appearance of careful research. From a criminological perspective, this explanation requires us to believe something remarkably complex, that someone not only learned John's exact bonus amount, but also understood that using that specific figure would make their ransom demand more convincing. This level of psychological sophistication, understanding how specificity creates authenticity, combined with the practical knowledge of that exact figure, creates a profile of criminal actor that doesn't match any other element of how events supposedly unfolded. We're asked to believe in someone sophisticated enough to understand psychological principles of believable staging, yet unsophisticated enough to execute a kidnapping that left no coherent escape route and required staying in the house for hours staging evidence. Let's shift to thinking about what the number reveals about the writer's relationship to money and to John's success. From a psychological perspective, someone external to the family would think about ransom amounts in terms of what they could extract, what would make the crime profitable. They wouldn't have emotional investment in the specific source of the money or what it represented in the family's financial life. But someone inside the family, someone who lived with John's success and what it meant for their security, might have a different relationship to that bonus amount. It might represent not just money, but status, security, evidence of John's achievement. And in choosing it as the ransom demand, they might unconsciously be expressing something about that relationship. Perhaps resentment, perhaps the psychological weight that money and success carried in the family dynamics. Perhaps simply that this number was so present in their consciousness that it felt natural, available, the right amount to use. From an anthropological lens, we can examine how different family structures handle financial knowledge and what that reveals about power dynamics and intimacy. In the family context we're examining, wives typically would know their husband's bonus amount. It's part of the shared financial reality of marriage, part of planning and managing household resources. This knowledge isn't unusual or requiring special access. It's simply part of being married, being embedded in the financial partnership of family life. So when we see this specific number appear in the ransom note, we're not looking at evidence of unusual access or sophisticated research. We're looking at evidence of the kind of ordinary, intimate knowledge that exists within marriages, that wives have about their husband's compensation, that exists as part of the fabric of shared financial life. The number's presence in the note tells us less about sophisticated criminal research and more about the writer's position within the family's intimate circle. From a logical investigative perspective, let's consider what it would mean if the amount was coincidentally close to John's bonus, but not exactly matching it. That would still be remarkable. Why would an external actor choose an amount in that specific range? But the fact that it apparently matched very closely or exactly creates a different kind of problem for the intruder narrative. Exact or near exact matching means either someone had specific access to documents showing this figure, or someone was so embedded in the family's financial life that they knew this number from conversation and memory. From a criminological standpoint, both possibilities point inward rather than outward, suggest someone who wasn't researching the family from outside but was living within the family's financial reality, for whom this number was already known, already significant, already available in memory, without requiring research or document access. So, when we consider the psychology of significance, why this particular number would have meaning for the writer, what it reveals about their relationship to John's success and the family's finances, how it exposes the writer's position within rather than outside the family's intimate financial circle, we're seeing evidence that compounds what the number's precision already suggested. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the choice of John's bonus amount as the ransom demand tells us the writer wasn't an outsider who researched and targeted. They were someone for whom this number already carried weight, already existed in consciousness, already represented something significant in their understanding of the family's financial life. The number is evidence not just of knowledge, but of relationship, not just of access, but of position, not just of information, but of the psychological significance that only intimate embeddedness in family life could create. Theme 3. The staging logic, when authenticity betrays intent. We've examined precision and psychological significance, and now we need to confront what this number means when we understand the note as staging rather than as Genuine ransom communication. Because if the note isn't actually about collecting money, if it's about creating the appearance of external involvement to redirect investigation, then the choice of John's bonus amount makes a different kind of sense, the wrong kind of sense, the kind that reveals staging rather than concealing it. From a criminological perspective, staging often contains exactly this pattern. The stager includes details meant to make the staging more convincing, without fully thinking through what those details reveal about who could have known them. The specificity that was meant to create authenticity becomes the very element that exposes the staging as coming from inside rather than outside. Let's think about what the writer might have been trying to accomplish by choosing this specific amount. From a psychological perspective, if you're creating staging, you're imagining what genuine ransom communication would look like and trying to replicate it. You might think a real kidnapper would research the family, would know their financial situation, would demand an amount that showed they understood the family's resources. So you choose a specific number, one that demonstrates knowledge, one that feels researched and targeted rather than arbitrary. You're trying to create authenticity. But what you don't fully process is that the specificity you're creating to make the staging feel authentic actually reveals that you already had the information, that you didn't need to research because you already knew, that your position relative to the family's finances is revealed precisely by the detail you thought was making your staging more convincing. From a philosophical perspective, this is the fundamental paradox of staging. The effort to create convincing evidence often produces evidence that's too convincing, that reveals knowledge or access the stager is trying to conceal. A truly external actor would likely avoid such specific knowledge even if they somehow possessed it, precisely because they would understand it narrows the investigative field toward people with insider access. But someone staging from inside, someone for whom the knowledge is so natural and available that they don't fully recognize how unusual it is, might include it thinking it adds authenticity without processing what it reveals. The staging becomes self-defeating, including details meant to convince while actually exposing the stager's true position. Now let's consider what would have happened if the note had demanded a round number: 100,000, 200,000, $500,000. From a logical standpoint, a round number would have served the stated purpose just as well, if not better. It would have communicated substantial demand without revealing specific insider knowledge. It would have been consistent with how actual criminals make ransom demands. It would have avoided creating an investigative lead pointing toward people who knew intimate family financial details. So, why choose the specific amount? The most plausible answer, because the writer wasn't thinking like a criminal, trying to avoid leaving evidence pointing toward themselves. They were thinking like someone trying to create convincing staging, and in their mind, specificity created authenticity. They didn't fully process that what they were revealing through specificity was their own insider position. Let's shift to thinking about what the number reveals about the writer's actual concerns during those hours. From a psychological perspective, someone genuinely planning a kidnapping for ransom would be focused on logistics: how to remove the victim, where to take them, how to make the exchange, how to avoid capture. The specific amount demanded would be secondary to these practical concerns. But someone staging a scene after something terrible has already happened has different priorities. They're not focused on actually collecting money. They're focused on creating a convincing narrative that will redirect investigation. And in that context, choosing a specific amount that seems researched and targeted might feel important, might seem like exactly the kind of detail that makes the staging convincing. The writer's priorities, their focus on details that create narrative authenticity rather than operational feasibility, reveal that they weren't operating as a genuine kidnapper, but as someone desperately trying to create believable staging. From an anthropological lens, we can examine how staging typically reveals itself across cases and contexts. One consistent pattern: stagers often include too much detail, too much specificity in their attempt to make false evidence convincing. A genuine actor operates from efficiency. They include what's necessary and nothing more. But someone creating false evidence often overcompensates, adding details they think make the staging more believable, without recognizing that these details actually create problems for their narrative. The choice of John's bonus amount, rather than a round figure, represents exactly this kind of overcompensation. Specificity meant to create authenticity that instead reveals insider knowledge incompatible with the external actor narrative the staging is meant to support. From a criminological perspective, let's consider what genuine ransom demands tell us about criminal thinking versus what this demand tells us about the writer's thinking. Genuine criminals understand risk and evidence. They know that every specific detail they reveal creates potential investigative leads, so they minimize specific information, keep communication functional and brief, avoid revealing knowledge that would narrow the field of possible perpetrators. But the note we're examining does the opposite. It includes specific knowledge, elaborate detail, information that dramatically narrows who could have written it. This pattern doesn't reflect criminal thinking focused on evidence minimization. It reflects staging thinking focused on narrative construction, someone trying to create a convincing story without fully understanding that every detail added to that story also added evidence revealing their actual position relative to the family. So when we consider the staging logic, how the choice of John's bonus amount was meant to create authenticity, but instead revealed insider knowledge, how specificity betrayed the writer's intent by exposing their position, how the priorities revealed in the number selection show someone focused on narrative rather than operational reality. We see the final piece of evidence that this number provides. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the $118,000 demand doesn't make sense as genuine ransom communication. It makes sense only as staging, as an attempt to create believable evidence of external involvement that failed precisely where the stager thought they were succeeding. The writer included John's bonus amount, thinking it made the note more authentic, more convincing, more like what a ransom demand would actually say. But what they revealed instead was their intimate knowledge of family finances, their insider position, their embeddedness in the very family they were trying to make investigators believe had been targeted from outside. The number sits in that note not as evidence of sophisticated criminal research, but as evidence of staging that exposed itself, specificity that betrayed intent, a writer who couldn't fully conceal their intimate access to information that should have remained private, but instead became the very element that points investigation inward toward family, rather than outward toward the fiction of strangers who could never have known such specific details about the intimate financial life of a family they supposedly targeted from the outside. We've walked through the precision that reveals insider knowledge, examined the psychological significance that exposes relationship to family finances, and confronted the staging logic that betrayed itself through the very specificity meant to create authenticity. What emerges isn't just doubt about whether an external actor could have chosen this number. It's recognition that the number itself becomes evidence, testimony to insider knowledge that narrows the field of possible writers to those embedded in the family's intimate financial life. $118,000, not a round number, not an amount explainable through external research, but a figure that matched John's bonus, that carried psychological weight within the family's financial reality, that revealed knowledge available only to those who lived within, rather than outside the family's most private financial circle. The number sits in that note like a confession, disguised as a demand, specificity that was meant to convince but instead exposed, detail added to create authenticity that actually revealed the writer's true position. And perhaps what's most telling is how this specificity has been explained away, rationalized, treated as coincidence or sophisticated research rather than what it most simply represents. Evidence that whoever wrote that note already knew John's bonus amount because they had intimate access to family finances, because they lived within the financial partnership of that marriage, because they were someone for whom this number wasn't research, but simply knowledge already possessed, already psychologically significant, already available in consciousness without requiring any investigation at all.